It was already bad enough to witness what was left of one train wreck, but years prior, I saw what was left of yet another train wreck. Only this one was a lot worse. Today, I am going to tell you a story from my childhood. This is the 2009 Cherry Valley train derailment and fire. June 19th, 2009, early in the morning, Canadian National Train U70691-18 was being assembled at the ethanol plant in Terra, Iowa. The train was 76 cars long, consisting of a hopper car loaded with gravel being used as a puffer car, and 75.111 tank cars loaded with more than 2.1 million gallons of denatured fuel ethanol. After the train was assembled, they did the required initial air brake test, and at 5:55 a.m. the train leaves Terra and continues about 110 miles before reaching Waterloo, where then they swap out for a second crew. The second crew then takes the train from Waterloo to Dubuque, milepost 183.2, where from there, a third crew was called in, and they would take the train from Dubuque to Hawthorne, milepost 8.9. The crew called in to handle the train that had arrived at just after 2 a.m. The crew consisted of 49-year-old Kenneth Slaughter, who had 16 years of railroading experience, and Thomas Fitman, the conductor, with only just less than 1 year. After doing the paperwork and doing the air brake test as required, the train left at 2:28 p.m. bound for Freeport, where there they would have to pick up a line of 38 cars before continuing east. Hours later, the train arrives in Freeport, and they contacted the RTC, who told the crew to hook up the line of cars directly behind the engines in front of the original consist. And after hooking the consist back up, the train was now 114 cars long, 78 loads and 36 empties, weighing in at 11,125 tons and at 6,940 feet long. At 7:16 p.m., the conductor contacts the RTC and lets them know that they're done with their work and are ready to continue east. And at 7:21 p.m., he contacts dispatch again, this time requesting a clear signal indication to leave the yard. And at 7:23, they begin crossing back into the single mainline track section out of Freeport and off to the city. However, what they didn't know was that the weather was going to take a turn for the worst. As the train nears Rockford, around milepost 85.6, the crew noticed that floodwaters were right up to the rails. This was in a section of Rockford that was known as the Diamonds, where the CN would split off and serve industries on the Canadian Pacific, the Union Pacific, and the Illinois Railway. The engineer contacts dispatch to let him know that they were going through floodwaters, and told him to keep in contact in case anything should happen. The engineer cut the speed of the train down to 17 miles an hour until around milepost 81.2, where after going over a hill, it speeds the train up to 34 miles an hour. And as the train is going over the multi-road railroad crossing, he feels a slight bump. But he didn't think twice about it. He thought it was just a small bump in the rails. He noticed his train cars were swaying side to side, but just thought maintenance needs to come by, take a look at it. However, more than a minute later, the emergency brakes come on and is alerted by this. Both he and Finman are surprised that when the train comes to a stop, and Slaughter asks the conductor to walk back and find out what's wrong, while he contacts the dispatcher and lets them know of their emergency brake application. It didn't take long for them to find what was wrong. After 40 car lengths back, the conductor sees a bright orange glow in the sky, but then looks down and sees that his train is actually on fire. And he contacts the engineer and lets him know of the situation and tell them to call emergency services. The engineer contacts RTC and tells someone at the desk to call 911 as the events began to unfold. Around 250 personnel across 80 different vehicles, as well as units coming in from the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department to help evacuate the residents who were living within a half-mile radius of the tracks, fearing an even bigger explosion, knowing that the tank cars that were hauling hazardous materials. The fire departments had about 400 gallons of fire retardant foam in their arsenal, as well as 900 more gallons of it coming in from the railroad, and in hopes that they could use it to combat the blaze. However, Cherry Valley Fire Chief Craig Wilt determined that with how intense the fire was burning at a temperature of around 3,900 degrees Fahrenheit, it was impossible for them to even try to get close to combat the fire, and while at it, it was determined that they would not have enough foam in their supply to fully put out the fire. So, an unfortunate decision was made, and the decision was to let the fire burn until it wasn't as intense enough to put the fire out themselves. 20.5 hours after the fire started, the blaze was finally put out, and residents could return home. The scene of the wreck was a mess. 19 cars went off the tracks and resulted in this massive fireball. Cars 57 through 75 had derailed, although 57 and 58, as well as 74 and 75, had derailed, but they too remained upright. The same can't be said for cars 59 through 73. As they derailed and had jackknifed into each other into a 400-foot-long pile. 2 tank cars loads full of ethanol, about 60,000 gallons, had leaked into the floodwaters, which had leaked into the Rock River, and as a result killed about 73,000 fish. And according to the Department of Natural Resources, this was, at the time, the largest non-natural fish kill in the history of the state of Illinois. And as bad as it was for the fishermen, there was also loss of human life. Rockford resident Zoella Tellez and her family were sitting in a minivan at the crossing when the train began to go by. However, when they saw the tank cars beginning to pile up, they just abandoned and started running away. However, she fell about 20 feet from her car, but as she tried to get up, it was already too late, as the tank cars began to explode, consuming her in the flames. Her husband, Jose, and 19-year-old daughter, Adriana, were both seriously injured with 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and were transported to a nearby hospital where they would be treated for their injuries. Some firefighters also got injured, as they too were rescuing people from the crossing while facing the intense heat, and were knocked back by the flames, but they too survived. Now the burning question on everyone's mind: how in the world could this happen? Turns out what caused this train to derail is exactly what would cause M337 to derail in 2017. A washout. Confused? Well, allow me to explain. At 7:35 p.m., about an hour before the train would go by, a driver was heading south on Mulford Road, and as they went over the UP tracks about 100 feet north, they noticed the flood waters going right underneath the CN tracks. They called 911 to call the railroad police to contact RTC to alert the crew of the U706 to stop. But this was due to the lack of a railroad bungalow in the area. It was after this call and a barrage more to the Winnebago County 911 Center that a deputy was sent to investigate the claims. And about 10 minutes later, a deputy was sent to the scene, and upon arriving, the deputy confirmed to his supervisor that the suspicions were true. Water was flowing right under the rails, and no ballast holding it in place, just rushing water about 17 inches underneath. just the spikes and the track beds that were just laying there with absolutely nothing to hold it up. There had been a culvert and quite a bit of heavy ballast to divert the floodwater. However, the storm that raged earlier dropped more than 3.5 inches of rain in less than an hour. As a result, both the culvert and the ballast stood no chance. In addition, there had been mini washouts on the Union Pacific in 11 different spots, although they weren't as bad as this one. Turns out that one of the mini washouts on the UP had exploded and contributed to the washout of the ballast and the culvert on the CN side. While at it, the crew of the CN didn't even notice, as it was only 4 feet from the crossing, which would explain why they continued on. Now, why didn't RTC contact the crew of the train? Well, at the time, the RTC working the desk, Darnell Parker, was not only working Desk 7, which covers the Freeport line, but also Desk 1, which focused more on the Iowa-Nebraska side of the CN route. Turns out he didn't know about the washout until the train had already derailed. And while at it, a crucial note that investigators found was that before the train reached Freeport, the RTC had been sent 2 severe weather alert bulletins, numbers 1055 and 3146. They were both issued to the Rockford area on account of the storm that went by. However, Parker did not tell the crew of the U-706 about the weather alert bulletins. So not only could the RTC be accountable on the account that not only was the line busy and that he couldn't be reached, and the fact that he was negligent to tell the crew of the severe weather alert bulletins, but it was also the design of the DOT 111 tank cars themselves, as they had a major and a dangerous manufacturing defect. Turns out the head and the shell of the tank car were underbuilt, and it just hadn't been built up to the crashworthiness standards. And while at it, springs that would help keep the car stable if it should bounce along the rails was also slightly denting the bottom of the tank cars, given the appearance that the tank cars had experienced some sort of structural failure, or it seemed the cars had been overused. And while at it, these cars, or a design like it, had been used for almost 20 years. One more detail, rather very important, is that where the train derailed was actually right above a pipeline owned by Nicor that was buried 11 feet underground. During the cleanup, a wheel and an axle frame had actually dented the 16-shell casing that was protecting the outer rim of the pipeline. It was reported that if the train had been traveling at track speed at 50 miles an hour, it's possible that they could have actually made gashes right into the pipeline, and the danger of the situation would have multiplied. Following the accident, the NTSB made recommendations to the FRA and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, both part of US DOT, to address the safety standards of shipping product by rail, as well as the structure of the pipeline, to ensure that should this kind of case happen again, that the pipeline is more built to a safety standards to where the pipe wouldn't just explode, or perhaps rather even leak. And they also made recommendations to the CN that should they receive AccuWeather forecast weather alert bulletins, to report them straight to the dispatcher's office, and also to the manufacturer who designed the tank car to improve its overall design. Following this, CN didn't even want them running on their trains in Canada until they were either rebuilt or replaced. And soon enough, they were replaced by the DOT 117 tank car, a much more robust and a much more heavily built and stable tank car design. After the accident, the lead 2 units were undamaged and returned to service. 15 of the 19 tank cars had been deemed destroyed and were scrapped. About a quarter mile of track was damaged and had to be replaced. The total estimated cost of the crash neared out to almost $8 million. Ouch. It has been 11 years since this wreck, and even every time I go into Rockford, I get a nervous feeling that it could happen again. But hopefully, a wreck like this won't happen again in the future. But unfortunately, that's all we can do.